Fellas, considering it's Israel Adesanya fight week and he's going to be fighting for a belt against Dricus du Plessis and he has a good chance of winning it, I'm going to be ranking every single title fight of Israel Adesanya's career, and the ranking system's going to go by how fun was the fight. Was it actually a fun fight? Was it good to watch? How memorable was the fight? So did anything significantly memorable come from this fight? Was it something you remember? And was there any significant moments? Was there a big moment in the fight that got clipped around? Was there a big chaos? Anything like that? So we're going to be ranking every single one of his title fights, from the worst title fight up into the best, using this criteria. And we'll start off at last place. At last place, I've got Israel Adesanya versus Yoel Romero, and my rating for this is a 2 out of 10. This is definitely, in my opinion, the worst title fight of Israel Adesanya's career. And we'll start off, if we look at the ranking system, I mean, first of all, how fun was the fight? 2 out of 10. It was terrible. People look at Adesanya, and a lot of people discredit him for the, the fights with Jared Cannonier and Whittaker. They like to call him a leg kick merchant, saying, oh, I only remember Adesanya for kicking people's legs. I don't even remember Adesanya, landing a leg kick on Yoel Romero. I remember nothing from this fight. This was so boring. Like, genuinely, this was the most boring fight. And the problem is, it was actually a lot of hype going into it. You've got Israel Adesanya, who was hyped up as the next big thing when it comes to striking in the UFC, against Yoel Romero, who's a freak of a human being. The amount of hype going into this fight was crazy. So for it to actually, just flop, it was disappointing to see, and in my opinion, definitely the most boring fight of his career so far. How memorable was the fight? I've given it a 3 out of 10. Again, nothing significant came from this fight. Nothing memorable came from this fight. The only memorable moment was the Yoel Romero, where he just stood there like he did against Paulo Costa, or like Paulo Costa did, did a bit of a shift, and that was all. That was the only memorable thing to come from this fight, and the fact that it was boring. It was only memorable for being a boring fight. That just tells you everything you need to know about this fight. And then the final criteria, was there any significant moments? No, nothing significant came from this fight. The best part of this fight was when the final bell rang. So Israel Adesanya versus Yoel Romero, definitely, in my opinion, the most boring fight of Adesanya's career. And even though we can sit here and shit on, the title fight that he had with Jared Cannonier, a lot of Europeans were complaining that they had to stay up till like 6 a.m. to watch that. At least it was miles better than Adesanya versus Yoel Romero. This might have gone down as one of the most boring title fights in UFC history, up there with the Rose Namajunas and Calder Esparza fight. So Adesanya, Romero, they're taking last place for this. Next fight we've got is Israel Adesanya versus Marvin Vettori 2, or the first title fight, or the only title fight that they had. This is getting a 4 out of 10. It's slightly better than Adesanya versus Yoel Romero. It wasn't terrible. This one didn't have any hype going into it. This was a really bad period in the middleweight division. I mean, we look at the middleweight division now, you've got guys like Strickland, you've got Whittaker, and I know Whittaker was at the top then, but, we've just got a lot of contenders right now in the middleweight division. Marvin Vettori got a title shot. That just tells you the state of the middleweight division. How fun was the fight? 4 out of 10. This was peak Adesanya leg kick edition. This was when Adesanya really started implementing those leg kicks. He didn't land anything significant against Marvin Vettori. Marvin Vettori didn't do anything either. He had good boxing, good wrestling, couldn't do anything significant either to Adesanya. So it was just a pretty much boring fight. Nothing really happened. Wasn't really fun to watch. How memorable was the fight? I've given it a 2 out of 10. Absolutely nothing memorable came from this fight. I mean, if you can think of one thing that came from this fight, fair enough. The only thing I remember coming from this fight was Adesanya mocking Marvin Vettori at the end of one of the rounds. That's it. So that's definitely the only memorable thing that came from this fight. And was there any significant moments? No, nothing significant. Apart from the thing I just said, absolutely nothing significant came from this fight. It was just a pretty dull fight in general. Pretty boring. Nothing really happened in this fight. And I'm just glad that we've gone past this state of the middleweight division where we're having fights like Adesanya versus Vettori, these snooze fests. And even though, again, you can critique Strickland for being boring, but at least it wasn't Adesanya Vettori level. So that's going in the second worst title fight of Adesanya's career, in my opinion. Then we've got Adesanya versus Jared Cannonier. This was disappointing because the card that this was on was really, really good. You had Sean O'Malley on the card. You had Sean Strickland on the card. It was such a stacked card. It was I think it was UFC 276, this might have been. But the main event definitely ruined it. It was a really poor main event. It was just, again, similar to the Vettori fight, Adesanya leg kick, so it's going to get a 4 out of 10 as well. Pretty much the same criteria as the Marvin Vettori fight. How fun was the fight? 4 out of 10. It wasn't really fun at all. It was just Adesanya outstriking Jared Cannonier. You know, nothing significant happened. There were never any big shots. There were never any nail-biting moments. It was just Adesanya beat Jared Cannonier. How memorable was this fight? Again, 2 out of 10. The only memorable thing about this fight was because of the card it was on. It was a really good card that it was on. It was on an absolutely stacked card, and that's the only reason why the fight was memorable. And it was memorable, I guess, because it also set up the fight between Adesanya and Pereira. But the actual scrap itself, absolutely nothing memorable came from this fight. Any significant moments? No. Nothing significant came from this fight. I remember watching this live and it was just so like disappointing. We had such a good, this was I think Volkanovski and Holloway co-main evented this. It was such a good scrap between the two of them. Volkanovski just piecing up Holloway. And then we had this. And the problem was Adesanya hyped it up as if he's going to get a finish. He kept saying, oh, I'm going to get a finish in this fight, this and that. And then he goes out there and does peak Adesanya leg kick in. It was just a really poor fight. Definitely one of the worst title fights of Adesanya's career. Then we've got Israel Adesanya versus Robert Whittaker number 2. So this is the rematch that they had. I'm going to give this a 6 out of 10. This is going to get a 6 out of 10 for me. It was just, at least it was kind of competitive this time. At least Robert Whittaker was trying to fire back. He made it kind of competitive. He didn't just, he wasn't just an Adesanya victim in this fight. It was a close fight, but again, was there any significant moments in this fight? No, nothing significant came from this fight, really. It was just a good scrap between the two of them. Whittaker was able to take Adesanya down a few times. He was able to land a couple of good shots on Adesanya. It wasn't just Adesanya, leg kicking a punching bag. It was a somewhat competitive fight. How memorable was the fight? It was memorable in the sense that a lot of people remember Peter thinking that Whittaker won this fight, so I guess that's what was memorable about it. And obviously it was the last time Whittaker got a title shot, so it was somewhat memorable. But it wasn't anything crazy. It was just a decent fight. Nothing terrible I can say about it. It wasn't as bad as Adesanya versus Romero or Vettori. But it was just a striking matchup and a bit of grappling implemented from Whittaker. That was the fight. I mean, that's all I got to really say about this fight. Then we had Adesanya versus Blachowicz, and that's also going to get a 6 out of 10. This had a shit ton of hype surrounding it. Adesanya at the time was undefeated in MMA. He was moving up to get his light heavyweight debut against Blachowicz, who was the current light heavyweight champion. There was a lot of hype going into this fight. Some people were picking Adesanya, some people were picking Blachowicz, and I've given it a 6 out of 10. Similar to the Robert Whittaker fight, how fun was the fight? It was quite fun to see. It was the first time we'd really seen Adesanya face some serious adversity. Well, it wasn't the first time, but it was one of the first times where we'd seen Adesanya face some serious adversity in the UFC. It looked like the fight wasn't going in his direction a lot of the time, and it was the first time we got to see Adesanya fight at light heavyweight. We're all intrigued, and it was the first time a lot of the casuals actually got to see Blachowicz fight as well. So was it a fun fight? It was all right. How memorable was the fight? It was memorable because it was it was a time when Adesanya moved up to the light heavyweight division. So I'll give it that. It was a memorable fight. But I think it should have been more memorable for the caliber that it was on, if that makes sense. Like, you've got undefeated Israel Adesanya, the champion of the world, going up to face Blachowicz, another champion of the world. I think it probably should have been a little bit more memorable. I feel like a lot of people kind of forget that this fight took place. It was big. It was a big fight at the time, which I guess is why it's somewhat memorable, but it could have been much bigger. Any significant moments? Not really. Blachowicz took Adesanya down. He was able to check a lot of those leg kicks. The commentary was appalling on this fight. I guess that was memorable. But apart from that, 8 to 6 out of 10. It was a good fight. Probably should have been better for the caliber that it was on, but it is what it is. Then we've got Adesanya versus Whittaker number 1. So this was the first time that Whittaker fought Adesanya for the belt and got KO'd pretty quickly. I'm going to give this a 7 out of 10. This was a really good title fight. These are the Adesanya fights that get put into the highlight reels. How fun was the fight? Well, I mean, it wasn't a significantly fun fight because it was quite a short fight. I feel like for a fight to be fun, it has to actually go on for quite a long time, but it was a good fight for the time it lasted. Whittaker was pushing a pace. It was going for the kill. Obviously, that costed him. How memorable was the fight? This was really memorable. I mean, it's probably the worst highlight reel of Whittaker's career. One of the best highlight reels of Adesanya's career. It was a memorable fight. A lot of people remember this fight. When they think of Adesanya, a lot of people remember him KOing Whittaker. And any significant moments? I mean, yeah, massive significant moments, like I just said. KO'd Robert Whittaker. So this was a really good title fight. And this is where Adesanya was dangerous. Adesanya with his counters. A lot of people wanted to tune into Adesanya after this. This was the perfect fights. These are the fights that hype Adesanya up. These are the fights that give Adesanya those highlight reels. It's fights like this. Went out there, KO'd Robert Whittaker, who was on a streak as well, and Whittaker looked really good going into that fight. And again, it's aged really well as well, because we know how good Whittaker is these days as well. So Adesanya versus Whittaker the first time around when he KO'd him, I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. It did hurt a little bit because I am a Whittaker fan, and I can't really give it anything more than a 7 considering it didn't really last that long, but it was memorable. It had a lot of fun moments with the KO, and he had a significant moment, so I'll give this one a 7 out of 10. Then we've got Israel Adesanya versus Paulo Costa. I'm also going to give this one a 7 out of 10. Yeah, this was actually a really good performance from Israel Adesanya. It wasn't just leg kicks. He absolutely battered Paulo Costa, and I wish we saw this same Adesanya when he was facing guys like Marvin Vettori and Jared Cannonier. He didn't look gun-shy in this fight, and that is why I really enjoyed this fight. How fun was this fight? It was really fun. Adesanya just piecing up Paulo Costa. And bearing in mind as well, Paulo Costa had a lot of hype going into this fight. He was undefeated. He was on a big streak in the UFC. He built a lot of hype going into this fight, so it was definitely a very memorable fight as well. This was a really big fight going into it, and Adesanya definitely performed. It wasn't just leg kicking him to a decision. He absolutely battered Paulo Costa until eventually he got the finish, and it was probably Adesanya's best performance. Well, maybe not his best, but one of his best performances in the UFC against Paulo Costa. And any significant moments, I guess Adesanya's celebration at the end where he went to hump Paulo Costa, which just says everything you need to know about Adesanya. I guess that was memorable, and pretty much just the whole fight as well. Him just battering Paulo Costa, who completely just got shut down in that fight with a ton of hype to his name. So I'm going to give this a 7 out of 10. I wish we saw this version of Adesanya when he was facing guys like Cannonier and Vettori, but yeah, really good performance from Adesanya in this fight, and this is the Adesanya that kind of made me a fan of him momentarily. I was actually quite a fan of Adesanya when he was having fights like this, and this was peak Adesanya, so I'll give this one a 7 out of 10. Really good performance from Adesanya, and you just can't hate it. Then we've got Israel Adesanya versus Alex Pereira number 2, where he knocked out Alex Pereira. I'm giving this one an 8 out of 10. This is definitely Adesanya's best highlight reel in his UFC career. Obviously, this was 2 title fights ago. This had everything. This was one of the most hyped title fights in history. I mean, how fun was the fight? It was a really good fight because even though it wasn't an absolute war, I'll talk about the first one as well. Both times when he fought Alex Pereira in the UFC, it was just so tense, and we'll talk about his second fight in a second, but it was just so tense because you've got 2 of the best strikers in the UFC, at least at the time, or maybe not the best strikers in the UFC, but at least in their weight class, going at it. You know that both of them can end it at any moment. Pereira was pushing the pace, seemed like he won that first round, and then because he just went out there and slept Pereira in the fashion that he did, this guy that has been basically haunting him for the past couple of years, the guy that's 3-0 against him, and he goes out there and knocks him out. I mean, it definitely had one of the most significant moments in MMA history. It was extremely memorable. Adesanya fans have a field day with this fight, and it was one of Adesanya's best performances, if not his best performance. So I'm going to give Adesanya versus Alex Pereira the rematch where he knocked him out an 8 out of 10. And I'm an Alex Pereira fan, by the way. I'm a fan of Alex Pereira. It wasn't good seeing him get knocked out by Adesanya, but I've got to give him credit where credit's due. The celebration was good as well. Adesanya had everything going for him in this fight, so I'll give this one an 8 out of 10. One of his best title performances in history, and it was just so tense, and yeah, I'll give this one an 8 out of 10. Next up, we've got Israel Adesanya versus Sean Strickland. I'm going to give this one an 8 out of 10 too. This was a really good title fight to watch. How fun was the fight? Now listen, it wasn't an absolute war, okay? It wasn't an absolute war. It wasn't a back and forth fight, and it wasn't as tense as Pereira versus Adesanya, but this was definitely a fun fight to see because of how many people this fight shocked. Everyone thought Adesanya was going to go in there, batter Sean Strickland, including myself. I made a prediction video saying that he's going to finish him quicker than Pereira did. And it wasn't that. After that first round when Strickland dropped Adesanya, I was glued to watching this fight. It wasn't an absolute war, but it was fun to see because it was like one of the biggest upsets in UFC history. Obviously, the most significant moment in this fight and the memorable moment in this fight was when Strickland dropped Israel Adesanya. That was definitely one of the most significant moments in the fight. That was when we all started to see the fight turn a little bit, and it was definitely a memorable fight as well. I mean, Sean Strickland gave him one of the biggest upsets in UFC history, winning the title against Adesanya. This was just after Adesanya KO'd Pereira as well. Definitely one of the most interesting title fights to watch. Like I said, it wasn't an absolute war, but because we just saw history be made with Sean Strickland just absolutely dog-walking Israel Adesanya across 5 rounds, and the fact that nobody expected it, this is getting an 8 out of 10 for me. Really, really impressive performance from Sean Strickland, and this was the make it or break it fight with Strickland, because if Strickland did beat Adesanya here, he wouldn't be that big of a star. And we all expected this to be like an Adesanya versus Cannonier or an Adesanya versus Vettori where he just batters Strickland, but that wasn't the case. It's getting an 8 out of 10. The next fight we've got is Israel Adesanya versus Kelvin Gastelum. This is getting a 9 out of 10. This is one of the best title fights in middleweight history. And this is definitely the best fight, in my opinion, of Adesanya's career. We talk about wars. This was that fight. This was an absolute war. Both of them beat the absolute crap out of each other. Adesanya looked bruised and busted after this. It was a very memorable fight for that reason. It was a real big test that Adesanya had. Gastelum looked battered at the end as well. It was just an absolute war. Adesanya nearly got finished. That was a significant moment as well. This had just had everything the title fight needed. You've got the young, up-and-coming guy in Israel Adesanya facing the guy who was an absolute killer at the time in Kelvin Gastelum. He really made Adesanya work for it. Adesanya won the fight at the end. It had everything a title fight needs, and I'm giving it a 9 out of 10. This was one of the best title fights in UFC history. It was just an absolute war as well. And that's everything a title fight needs. I wish we saw this version of Kelvin Gastelum these days. These days he seems to be a bit undisciplined. Doesn't seem to be the same killer he once was. But this version of Kelvin Gastelum that fought Adesanya was a killer. And I'm giving this a 9 out of 10. Definitely one of his best title fights, if not his best title fight in UFC history. And at number 1, I am going with Israel Adesanya versus Alex Pereira, the first fight, 10 out of 10. This might have been one of the most enjoyable and most, just everything about this fight, every single thing about this fight was perfect. The build-up, this one of the biggest rivalries in UFC history. The fact that Pereira had just come into the UFC to save the middleweight division and had the backstory, the fact that he was coming into this fight 2-0 against Adesanya in kickboxing and had just KO'd Sean Strickland. The fact that the fight was, extremely tense the whole way because even though Adesanya was winning the majority of the fight, Alex Pereira, we all knew that he could finish it at any moment. And then in the 5th round, when we all thought Adesanya was going to cruise to a decision, Pereira shocks everyone, drops Adesanya, finishes Israel Adesanya for the first time in his MMA career. Goes out there, finishes Adesanya, takes the middleweight belt away from him, first middleweight to ever beat Israel Adesanya, and we finally get a new middleweight crowned, and the rivalry continues. This was, in my opinion, one of the best title fights in UFC history, and the fact that it's probably one of the most high-level striking matchups you're ever going to get in MMA. One of the highest level striking matchups. This could have been on Glory Kickboxing at the highest level too, and it was, obviously, because they're both kickboxers as well. So Adesanya versus Alex Pereira the first time around, I think this had everything a title fight needed, and in my opinion, I'm going to say this is the best title fight of Israel Adesanya's career, and I'm giving it a 10 out of 10 in comparison to the rest. So that is how I would rank every title fight of Israel Adesanya's career. To be honest, I don't think the Dricus one is going to be a mid. Well, I think it'll be decent. I think he'll KO Dricus, which will make for a significant moment. But let me know your thoughts on what you think the best title fight of Adesanya's career was and your predictions for his fight with Dricus. Yeah, just let me know. Thank you for watching.